Welcome. I put in the intro to the promotional material for this event that, radio and music always entertains, but it can never be reduced to mere entertainment. They're always a change agent in human life. And so it was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when underground, freeform, and countercultural radio stations took to the airwaves amidst serious social and cultural changes taking place around the country. And so today we're going to look at how that all played out, what it still means today, and explore a landmark era at WBCN in Boston and WTJU in Charlottesville. So I want to introduce Bill Lichtenstein, who's able to join us. Let me go ahead and turn off my screen share as well. Bill Lichtenstein, who's able to join us, as well as he is the filmmaker of the movie, WBCN and the American Revolution documentary that is now available for streaming at WTJU's website, WTJU.net. If you haven't had a chance to give it a watch, then please do. Also joined by Marcia Doran, WTJU DJ and program director from 1974 to about 1982. And Marcia is still a big supporter and involved with WTJU. And also Rus Perry, who was a WTJU DJ and station manager from 1972 to 76. And Rus actually is involved now and recently hosted a much celebrated Jazz at 100 show that's distributed around the country and airs on about a dozen public radio stations, and is resurrecting that model for a new Jazz at 100 today, Today, Jazz at 100 today, exactly. And so we'll be airing that on Friday mornings. So I kind of want to get things started, turn to Bill Lichtenstein with this film. Take me through some of the origin story. Why did WBCN fill a niche when there were already some solid college radio stations in Boston at the time?
When there were already, college radio stations.
Yeah.
The college stations back then weren't what we think of as college stations today. They were training grounds for young people who wanted to be professional radio announcers, and is noted in the film, professional in those days meant having a slick delivery, and I think a lot of it, the film looks at how this radio station changed both radio and media in a lot of ways, and also it overlays a lot of the great social, political, cultural changes that took place during that period that the station was a part of. But I think the impact on radio was really the difference between what had come before it, which was radio was more or less a performance that you turned on, and the whole idea of radio being a conversation with its listeners was unheard of. And in a lot of ways, this sort of pre-shadowed public radio and community radio in that sort of two-way dialogue with listeners that the station had.
Yeah. Why do it? I mean, the social forces at the time, I was kind of looking, was watching the film, and it seemed like this kind of, peculiar vision of one guy with sort of an entrepreneur model. But then he got a whole ragtag bunch of DJs to come be a part of it. Why do it? Why start WBCN in the way that y'all did?
Well, it's a really interesting untold story, which is that these three institutions that had a pretty major impact, on that period in time. One was the Boston Tea Party, which was the first rock club in America outside of the Fillmore West, where groups from England were coming in 67, 68, Led Zeppelin and The Who and all these great blues artists. WBCN and the Phoenix newspaper were all started by a Harvard law student. And it was a complete, chance. He had signed a lease on a church, an old abandoned or former church, for some friends that was supposed to be used to open an outpost of Andy Warhol's Filmmakers Collaborative in Boston. And they told him they had money from the Ford Foundation. So as a favor, he went over and signed the lease and gave them a $5,000 check of his money so that he would be reimbursed for, and then found out that the Ford Foundation was not going to give them any money and was stuck with this church. And so they started playing rock and roll there. And all of these, the list is exhaustive, from Led Zeppelin, The Who, everybody came through there. And what he noted was that kids were coming out and lining up to see these bands, but you couldn't hear any of this music on the radio. And that's where he first got the idea of not only, which was happening in one or two other cities, playing rock and roll on FM, which was a newly evolved, band on radio, but this whole idea of having conversational tone with students and, only 8 commercials an hour, and just making something that sounded very different than what radio had ever sounded like before.
Let's, I want to shift things over a little bit to WTJU's experience back in the early 70s as well. One sort of interesting parallel, I think it was kind of an accidental parallel, is that WBCN, before the rock and rollers took over, had been a classical station, which is not unlike WTJU in a certain sense. We also, here in Charlottesville, had run an almost entirely classical station, but then the rockers showed up, and we also had some jazz shows and occasionally folk shows. So I want to ask, Marcia and Rus, how did you all see the role of WTJU back then?
Well,
Rus, do you want to go first?
I'll kick off. I think I should recognize that one of our cohort from the class that started in 1972, William Tandy Young, is actually on the call with us.
Oh, cool.
Hey, Willie, how are you? And I think maybe Pat Bawley, who showed up the next year, is also here on the call. So we have some other folks with other perspectives as well. It's interesting. Although it's a bit of a deep. Oh, there's Pat and Cindy. There's one of the deep dark secrets of my past is that I went to prep school, and I went to prep school outside of Boston, and I started in 1968. So I was listening to BCN as I was 14, 15, 16 years old, and I was going back home to Washington D.C. and listening to WHFS, which a number of us have in common here. Marcia, Pat, myself, we're all HFS listeners, as well as a fellow who is not on the call here, Hal Dean, who was at the station when we all showed up. He had come in at 1970, and he grew up. Well, he not grew up because HFS didn't start until I think 69. But anyway, it was there was a lot of this same treating the music seriously. As seriously as a bunch of stoned college students could treat music, but treating the music seriously as a vehicle for creative expression, where it wasn't just we're going to play records until the next ad, which is really why we're here, to push ads at you, but to say that the music was what was important, and how the music was sequenced, and having people understand and hear the music differently through the combination and the synergies, the audio synergies that came up, was a very important thing at BCN, was a very important thing at HFS. And both of those stations started over time to achieve what we might today call a no label kind of attitude about music, where you could play George Harrison, Beware of Darkness, and then go into Hank Williams' I Saw the Light, because you saw a link between these things in terms of the story that they were telling, despite the fact that one was a very old, at that time, seemingly old, although it was probably only like 10 years old, country music song, and the other was a very current British rock tune. That was those kinds of, the attitude that it was about what the music was saying or what it sounded like that was important, not where it stood on some sort of commercial chart. And that became very important to us, and we had all learned it from examples like BCN and like HFS, and tried it ourselves, and found out that it was a lot of fun, and there were a lot of people interested in listening to it.
Marcia, I want to turn to you. What did you all think you were doing? What impact were you hoping to have?
Well, I pretty much echo what Rus was saying. I came to TJU because I wanted to play music that hadn't been played before. I wanted to play, there was so much out there. There was that I was discovering, like John Coltrane or the Balinese monkey chants. And, you're not going to hear that on WUVA, which was the other student station at the time. And it was geared towards top 40 with a format that was very slick at the time. And in fact, the first time I heard the Balinese monkey chants in its entirety was on TJU. I just rolled into town in 1974. And I turned on TJU, and there was this cool jazz DJ, and he was playing the monkey chants. And I recognized it because I'd heard snippets of it before. And for those of you who haven't heard the monkey chants, you really should. It's really cool. And yes, that's one of my cats. I do not have a black snake in my house. That's my kitten. Anyway, I was just, I was a product of the DC countercultural scene. And I had a friend who was working at WHFS, Surf Caldwell. And I was telling Rus before the broadcast started that Surf actually had sort of tutored me in being a DJ before I went off to college. I knew him when I was still in high school. In fact, we're still friends now, but that's another story. And so I had, like Rus had mentioned, I had really become enamored with underground radio because it was playing all sorts of different things that you didn't hear on normal radio. And it was, the universe of music, and it was really cool. And I wanted to be part of it. Plus I had friends that were musicians, and we were discovering music, and it was just this vibrant thing that I thought was fun. So that's how I got there. And as I said, I'm pretty much echoing everything that Rus said.
The role of music discovery, it seems like, has always been right at the core of what stations like these do. And I was struck by one of the, really two quotes in the film, and I don't remember who said them at this point, but one of them was that WBCN was not so much giving people what they wanted as shoving music down their throats.
From one of the program director. One of the things early on that they encouraged, as they're starting to sort of figure out what this would be, encouraged people to do, was just imagine that they're in their living room with their friends. And I think it goes to what you were saying, which is the whole difference in the relationship with music. And we talked about it in the film, a new album, Beatles album, would come out. And first thing is, you would rush to get it. And then you would bring it home. And not only would you listen to the music, but you would pore over the album cover and read the notes and discuss it with your friends. And then people would get together. And one of the things a number of people recalled when we were doing interviews was just people getting together to listen to albums. We've got the new Beatles album. People would come together and sit and just listen, and then discuss, what the lyrics meant. And that kind of relationship with music, was very important. It was a central part, I think, of people trying to understand what was going on in their world and to make changes in it.
Bill, the timing of this is interesting too, because over the years, I've become a bit of a historian of jazz, and the LP gets pushed out into the world in 1948, and very quickly becomes there are no more singles in the jazz world. I mean, VJ continues to issue the occasional Wayne Shorter single to sales of a dozen, but really it becomes an album thing, and then so jazz starts to be 5, 6, 7 minute cuts instead of 3-minute cuts. Well, although rock and roll, it transitions from rhythm and blues around that same kind of period, it adopts the 45 format and stays a 3.5 minute single oriented thing until about the time we're speaking of. Fresh Cream comes out in the US in January of '67, and it's got 5.5 minutes of sleepy time. Well, that was not put on that record so that it would be played on top 40 radio. I mean, it just wasn't. Well, what was its avenue? it was, as you say, people getting together in living rooms and dorm rooms and rec rooms and in secret and whatever, and listening to these things. And there wasn't an avenue over the air until places like college radio sometimes, but places like BCN began to do that. And we saw that as a way of sharing this music. There wasn't any other place to share it. It became a very relevant part of a whole cultural shift in the music.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead. Just want to let you know, remind everybody who's on here. First, thanks for coming. We're talking about the film WBCN and the American Revolution, which you can stream at WTJU.net for the next 2 weeks. And it's a terrific partnership between Bill's film production company and community radio stations across the country. So thanks again, Bill, for being a part of it. If you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the Zoom group chat. I am monitoring that. So if you've got anything you'd like to ask one or all the panelists, please go ahead and type that in. But yeah, Marcia, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing. I just said, yep.
I want to talk a little bit about the sort of period of political unrest. I mean, we're talking about an era where the Vietnam War was just sort of getting worse and worse as far as the news, where Nixon was in office, where there's a lot of social and political unrest going on. The film goes into a lot of that. Bill, what was the sort of key role for the station at that era, for that in that sense?
Well, it was a period not unlike today, where there are these enormous, issues coming up that it seemed like something earth-shaking was happening every day. Great transformative changes going on, and unlike today, where you can pick up, the internet or your cell phone at any hour of the day or night and see what's going on, there were very few ways to find out what was happening. If there was a riot on the Boston Common or a demonstration, or there might be a mention of it in the Boston Globe, or it might be on the local TV station, but there was very little coverage of those things. So BCN became sort of an important, point of communication with its listeners. And I think one of the things that grew out of that, interestingly, was what became very important to that era and to BCN and to stations like BCN, which was the idea of free expression. It really had to do with the fact that people were being asked to go fight in this war, a legal war on the other side of the world. And a lot of people were speaking up about that, and you did so at your risk. If you burned your draft card, you could go to jail. And so people were encouraging people to speak up. And the station, as part of that, felt, I think, that its responsibility was to speak up. And in some cases, that manifested itself in playing songs that had the F word, not because, they're trying to be provocative, but it was an expression, in a song like Working Class Hero or We Can Be Together by the Jefferson Airplane. It was an expression of what was of an artist, of what was going on, and the station felt it important to play those things. So it became, I think, it started with the music and became much more politicized, as the draft became a bigger issue, and then these other issues that really helped sort of transform the country during that period. But I think it's very much like today. The one thing that that was sort of unique to that period, I thought, but it turns out not, that I considered trying to figure out how to best work in, was the idea. There was a quote, I thought it was from Mark Rudd, the SDS founder, and I think it may have in fact been from Ralph Gleason, who started Rolling Stone. But he said, people forget in those days that no matter what you were doing, if you were studying for school or shopping or making love to your girlfriend, somewhere in the back of your mind, we were always thinking, we've got to get rid of Nixon. And I just thought that was such a critical part of that era that had sort of didn't translate, to later years. And suddenly here we are again, where I think it's fair to say, no matter what you're doing, somewhere in the back of your mind, I don't want to presume what people's political bents are, but clearly Trump is on people's minds no matter what you're doing these days. So there's a similarity there, I think.
Yeah.
No, this is interesting, Bill. The whole political story of BCN and its support for, publicity for things like the moratorium and so many activities that were happening in Boston at the time. I was wrestling with why TJU had so little of that actually going on in the period of 72 to 76. And I think one thing that was happening is that the immediate 4 previous years, although Nixon spanned from 68 all on in, but that immediate 4 previous years were much more publicly political than the following years. And if you look at the sequence of the major marches on Washington, for example, you got really big stuff happening, 68, 70, 70 especially. But by the time you get to 72, 73, even though the war was going on, we were still getting draft numbers. We had the impeachment of Nixon. I mean, there was a lot of stuff to go and pound the pavement about. There wasn't as much going on. The Equal Rights Amendment was in the process of getting discussed publicly, and there was plenty of opportunity for that to be a big deal in Washington. But those kinds of demonstrations drew far fewer people in 74 than they did in 70, for example. And I think we kind of tracked that, and we're part of a, were we tired by that time? Was that something we did in high school and we didn't do in college? I'm just not sure. But we were not as political in that period as even as many of us had been in high school in the previous period of time. It was just very different all of a sudden, and it would be interesting to hear other people's perspective on why that was. But you did not see WTJU arranging buses to go up to Washington for marches, or taking an active role in creating conversations around the feminist imperative and so forth. We just didn't do as much of that. Now, I actually challenged several of us here on the call. Harry Sleeper, who was at the time the most political person I knew, and still today is the most political person I know. And he was started in 72 in the same with many of us in this group. He says that there was a lot in the way of political satire being played on the radio, and not as much sort of direct action, not the kind of heroic stuff of stealing files from the dean's office and reading them on the air. We weren't doing any of that kind of stuff, but I think there was some political satire being expressed through the music and through spoken word.
Yeah, I agree with what Rus was saying. There was certainly a political undercurrent, but it wasn't as activist as radio had been in the preceding few years. I didn't get to Charlottesville until 1974, and a lot of things had calmed down by then. Nixon was already out, etc. But I do remember May Day, the May Day demonstrations in DC, and both WGTB and WHFS were playing a very active role at that point. But yeah, when I got to Charlottesville, there was this sort of progressive underground in the town, and a town that was largely very conservative. But it did become a little bit more, it was more understated, like playing the Firesign Theater and playing the music, letting the music speak for our thoughts.
Marcia, there's when I first started here about 10 years ago, almost 9 years ago at WTJU, I remember you told me a line that has been with me since then, which is that in Charlottesville, you can be mad as a hatter as long as you're polite.
Yes.
And I found that to
Yes.
mostly be true. So like you can be fully political as long as you're kind of polite about it. But Bill,
Yes.
I wanna go back to the film for a minute because I think one factor that TJU never had was a Danny Schechter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tell me about Danny and the kind of news department that he ran.
Yep, I just need to pop my power cord slipped out. Give me 1 second.
Oh yeah, sure.
And I just want to say to the discussion we're having, because a lot of it was considered where to end the story, because BCN continued on, and sort of became more or less a very successful commercial rock station, but much different than the kind of station it was in its earlier days. And I think we say it in the film, it was a combination of first, a lot of the stuff, the music, the culture, the politics, got absorbed by mainstream culture. So it was commodified, and the Who was playing 20,000 seat stadiums, Bob Dylan, all of this became very commercially successful. The war ended, so the threat of being drafted went away. And I think people were just kind of exhausted by the departure of Nixon. It'll be interesting to see, frankly, and certainly, Charlottesville is a city, I think, that likely you will see this very clearly because of the activism there and the deep effects that it's had on the community. If and when Donald Trump leaves, and then give it 6 months or a year or two, will this kind of activism sustain itself, or will people sort of just feel exhausted and we got him out? And I think in the 60s and early 70s, around 74, it did move from sort of the we generation to the me generation. This whole idea that by looking out for my own best. I remember, this was an article in New York Magazine, and the premise was based on a book that if you looked out for yourself and if you were selfish, the world would be a better place. And so me generation was a tremendous transformation of what had come before. Danny Schechter, one of the interesting things about BCN was it had probably the most radical newsroom in America. You had all these people who had some connection with the Weatherman, Andy Kopkine, who was just, a leading left-wing journalist, wrote for The Nation and Village Voice. And then you had people who were in Boston who served as the Greek choir, who would come on and respond to a Nixon address, like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn. And, it became a very powerful part of the programming. One of the things about news, and that's where I started when I was there originally as a volunteer and then started doing news. One of the things I think, and it wasn't fully explored in the film, the BCN, the legacy of BCN, was to take news and put it in context using comedy and music, and then in some ways, by doing that, it became more credible. And I think it's a kind of historic antecedent to if you look at The Daily Show or Stephen Colbert and go, how is it possible that a stand-up comic or a comedian like Jon Stewart could be considered the most credible journalist in America, given what he does? It's precisely that. It's by taking news out of the context of this objectivity and both sides of the story, and adding comedy and music to it, you can somehow tell a more honest and truthful story. And I think BCN was involved with that very early on, where we would take Nixon speeches and intercut them with music for the Firestone Theater. But yeah, no, very, very radical and involved in what became later, the whole idea of, Boston. Danny mentions it in the film. Boston was really a place. Dan Ellsberg was here, I think, where people were committed to exposing what was going on in this previously unknown triad of universities, corporations that were making money off the war, and the government. And through the Pentagon Papers, but a lot of the things BCN was doing, the break-in in Media, Pennsylvania, of the FBI office, which BCN was involved in releasing documents from that. I think there was a lot of effort to try to expose what was going on, at that time that has, continued to give. It was the beginning of what has given people a sense of how a lot of this worked.
Wanted to talk a little bit also about some of the different social aspects that are social forces that are going on in the film. You kind of touch on a lot of things. It's like, early LGBT programming, and also the role of women. In 1969, 1970, the film mentions that, it's kind of unusual and to hear a woman's voice hosting on the air. And there's a fairly moving story about these women who love BCN, love listening. And then one of the hosts starts talking about chicks this and chicks that, and they get pissed off and show up with a bunch of like small chicks, like actual baby chickens, make a point. Talk about that a little bit, the gender dynamics that we're changing. And then I want to, we'll transport that to TJU after.
Sure. I think one of the things I wanted the film to show was not only how media can create change, but I think what change was created. And I think it is eye-opening for a lot of younger people, younger women, to understand that at that point, in the late 60s, it was almost unheard of for women to be in broadcasting, certainly not on the radio. And part of it, which was a widely trafficked bit of nonsense, was that women's voices, because they were higher in pitch, were essentially annoying. I first heard that in researching the film, and then as I talked to people, they would say, no, my college, the person that ran the college station used to say that, or, totally ridiculous, obviously. But it was one of the ways that women were kept off the air. And at BCN, through this mention of, it was a public service announcement where, as evolved and PC as BCN was, they actually said that a local drug rehabilitation clinic was looking for volunteers. And if you were a therapist and wanted to volunteer, they needed your help. And if you were a chick and could type, they needed your help too. And a group of women who would become Bread and Roses, the very seminal, important feminist collective that did Our Bodies, Ourselves. One of them was driving around and professed that they love BCN, but they heard this, they had to do something about it. BCN, to its credit, gave them a weekly woman show, which interestingly, in 1971, was more or less a consciousness-raising group that they had, which they taped and then put on the radio. And what's so interesting in going back and listening to the discussion, some of which is in the film, is that the roots of the second wave of feminism were so early on. I mean, the discussions were things around, why is my boyfriend's career so important and mine isn't? And, issues of many things that we're still dealing with today, of reproductive rights, domestic violence. And so to its credit, BCN not only gave them the show, but then they ended up bringing on 3 women announcers, one of whom was Maxine Sartori, who over the years has been credited with discovering the Cars and Aerosmith, and was not, they thought they were hiring sort of a dyed-in-the-wool feminist, and what they got was a very serious rock and roller in Maxine, who really sort of helped change the face of music. But, I think that's an example not only of what happened then, but how change can happen. And I think one of the things I want the film to do is give people the sense that if there's something that they don't like, that they can make a difference in how media can be used to do that. I think you're,
Nathan, your mic might be off.
Yeah, there we go.
You're right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Just talking about gender at WTJU as well. This was the leadership team in 1966, and then just a few years later, after UVA let in women, and of course then WTJU also let in women, it looked more like this. And it was a transformation of kind of what the station sounded like and looked like. And I want to hear from Marcia. What was your experience? You were among the 4th class of women to be part of UVA?
Yeah, I came in the fall of 1974. And when I got to UVA, there was a very definite atmosphere of sexism there, in the student body, not at TJU. But I did encounter it a bit, and it was, as I said earlier, generally when I encountered sexism, I treated it with the contempt that it deserved. and ignored them and barreled on despite it all. I just wasn't gonna put up with it, and I didn't. But yeah, in those early days, I got a lot of the women got statements, heard things like, "Well, for a chick, you really know a lot about music," or better yet, "Well, you're a chick. Why aren't you playing stuff like Joni Mitchell? Why are you playing this Furry Lewis guy? That's the blues. Why aren't you playing Joni Mitchell?" And I was like, "I think Joni Mitchell's neurotic and complains about her love life too much," which I did. And I really didn't care for Linda Ronstadt. But anyway, there was a little bit of it at the station, but not much. But outside of the station, there was still the good old boy network going on. And over time, it's diminished. I don't think Charlottesville is like that anymore. At least I haven't really encountered it when I've gone back. But we just, the women that were on the air with me back then, I think they were like me. They just, sneered and went about their business and proved all those bozos wrong. I was going to say something else, but I think this is more appropriate.
Bozos.
But it was, this was right at the beginning of a general admission of women to the university. And I think the year that we started was the first year that women were in the dorms in 72. I had the extreme good fortune of the WTJU was in the basement. I was on the second floor, and the woman who I'm fortunate enough to be able to say became my wife of now forever was on the third floor. And so we had we met through that same living situation. But everybody who had come to UVA before us basically was guys who had this reputation of, the road trip to the girls' school and all the other kind of nonsense. And I had asked Marcia kind of privately before this all started, were we assholes like that too?
No, you weren't.
That's good to know, because
you guys were the oasis for me. For my first year.
I do remember having a lot of women on the air. I don't remember it being like, oh my God, we got to figure out how to get more women on the air. There aren't enough, or we are not being representative. I think there were plenty of very skilled announcers who were dedicated to the music, who wanted to participate of all genders. And interestingly enough, although, and I would say, Marcia, that I don't remember us being particularly vocal about feminism and women's rights. And although it was a time when there was a lot of that, again, we were not as political as we might have been. But we also had members of the volunteer staff, the student staff, who were in what we would now call the LGBT community, but they were not open about it on the air, as far as I know. I don't recall them being open about it on the air, unlike the BCN story, which was courageous. I think you can only describe it as courageous at that time. But so there's this undercurrent at TJU of we were getting a lot of stuff right, I think, but we weren't talking about it a whole lot. And I can't really tell you why that was.
It's interesting. I think one of the things about the early gay and lesbian broadcast that John Scagliotti and Andy Kopkind did, that's talked about in the film, and John mentions it was not a concerted effort to make a statement or to push the edge of the envelope. It really was about them wanting to do a show about what interested them. It was a slot on Sunday nights where if you were at the station, you could claim an hour of airtime and do a show about something that interested you. It was called Potluck. And so there are all kinds of different interesting things. And they did a show basically looking at, gay life in Boston and what music people were listening to. And as John said, to them, it was about their friends and what they, interested them. And he said, but, it's a 50,000 watt station. And suddenly in 1971, there's this gay thing on the radio, and in New Hampshire and Western Massachusetts, and people turn, and there it is. And it just had such an impact, particularly on young people. They just got so many letters from young people who just said, I was at the end of my rope with, trying to deal with things in my life. And then I heard this show, and it saved me. It just made me realize there's other people out there. And but sometimes, and I think BCN in a lot of ways, we're not always aware of the impact by playing bands or by taking certain stands and stuff, what the impact would be. It just seemed like the right thing to do. And then years later to hear what the impact was really interesting.
I want to let you know you all can ask questions if you got them. We've gotten a couple of comments from Zengomi. Thanks for those. One of them here is that kind of looking at that transformation of we and rebellion and kind of political involvement in an organized way to a more kind of me hedonistic thing, just points to kind of glam rock as maybe that turning point. But also just wanted to kind of bring it back to some of the values. I mean, over the course of the conversation here, I'm hearing that WBCN and also WTJU, really were about, authenticity. It's not trying to be some objective sort of like voice from nowhere. Also very much committed to creative expression and just the idea of using media to discover things and make change. And those are some values I think still carry forward in some stations across the country. The one big change or difference rather is, WBCN was a commercial radio model. It had an owner. It had a sort of entrepreneur's vision who there was a guy in charge. And TJU has been this non-commercial, granted also very small market, but we have in some ways still kept, when WBCN was being sold in the late 70s or and turned into something else by the 80s, TJU was the first in the country playing punk from DC with Ian MacKaye, so that kind of difference, just that it managed to kind of keep going with the non-com model. I mean, how did the film talks about this a little bit, but tell me some about like the money of it and kind of how it changed over the years.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So the station originally, like in the 50s and the 60s, FM came along. And the big advantage of FM was it had no static and it was stereo. So it seemed like the perfect place for classical music, and most of the early FM stations were classical music stations. This guy, T. Mitchell Hastings, who had been a friend of Major Armstrong, who helped invent FM radio, and he had invented a number of devices that were used in FM broadcasts, had this idea that he wanted to have a string of classical stations up and down the East Coast called the Concert Network. So there was BCN, Boston, HCN in Hartford, NCN in New York. But by the late 60s, they were all effectively going bankrupt. They couldn't sustain, the ad revenue that they needed to be on the air. So when Ray Riepen was looking for a station to try to get on the air with this idea he had for a new kind of radio, he saw that BCN was on the verge of, they'd been in bankruptcy once and they were teetering on the edge again. He pulled Dun & Bradstreet reports and looked at their finances. And so he approached T. Mitchell Hastings, and initially in the hours between 12 midnight and 6 in the morning, which was the only time it was on playing rock and roll, they started making more money than the rest of the day. So quickly it became 24 hours, and then quickly it became the top grossing like FM station in the country, charging AM rates. It just exploded. But interestingly, throughout that whole period, up through the early to mid 70s, the hierarchy or the way the station was run was like a kibbutz. There was no top-down management. If an ad came in and people felt like we're not going to run this, it didn't get run. If in the rare case that a national company wanted to run a commercial product, and the two that come to mind were Colombo yogurt. Before people had ever heard of yogurt, Colombo started selling yogurt in America, and Calso Earth shoes, which were a shoe where the heel was sort of lower, which were kind of hip products. They literally had to come make a presentation to the staff. Colombo pulled up with a truck and just loaded up, you know, cases of their yogurt. And once everybody felt comfortable with it, then we did it. But there was no imposition of anything on anybody there, from what you would say, what kind of music you would play, with the exception of anything that would lose the license. That's where they would draw the line. But so it was the most egalitarian of places, and anybody from a volunteer answering the phones to a secretary up through, you know, Al Perry, who was the general manager, but was one of us, you know, sort of had an equal say. By the mid 70s, T. Mitch had this crazy idea that he wanted to move the station from where it was in this kind of dive office to the top of the Prudential Tower in Boston, which arguably had to be the most expensive real estate in New England. It was in the skywalk on the 50th floor of the tallest building in New England, tiny space. It had to be the most valuable per square foot real estate. And he moved the station there, and suddenly you had a situation where the rent went through the roof. People who were making $6 an hour are going to work in this very expensive setting, and so they start thinking about asking for more money. And it drove, I think, a need for more and more money, which broke down the walls about what kind of commercials the station would run. They started taking national spots, started taking spots for things that they wouldn't have early on, where they were very picky about what spots they ran. It was hard to get on the air there if you didn't have like a sort of progressive company or product or store. And it just became from there, you know, sort of a moneymaker, and eventually was bought by the guys who started Infinity Broadcasting and Howard Stern, and, you know, was off in another direction. But, you know, commercially, it just did fabulous, but people, that wasn't the reason people did what they did. They weren't looking at the ratings. And it really was, you know, the discussions around any particular issue really were the purest, you know, what we want to do what's best for our listeners, and we want to, you know, help change things. And again, it's wonderful to see what's going on in the world today, because there's a similar attitude. I don't know how many companies there are right now, but there must be many where people are sitting around discussing what can we do to help promote a better America in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of the environment, whatever it is. And that's really what BCN was steeped in.
Do you think the was that move to the top of the Prudential building the sort of beginning of the end of what WBCN kind of represented?
Well, it cut both ways. Danny Schechter noted, and I think it's true, that by not being, you know, sort of in the basement of a church someplace, but top of the tallest building in Boston, and everybody knew they were there, that it kind of gave voice to people, and people had a relationship with the station. You know, it was sort of there for people. And while it was at the Prudential, you know, the first few years remained as radical, as accessible to people. There was a line I put into an early funding proposal where I said something like, anybody calling the station knew they were always a button push away from being live on the air. And it's true, people would call up with some problem and suddenly they're on the radio. And there was that kind of, you know, we're all in this together attitude, I think, that persevered.
Yeah, we had some business sponsors throughout the years at WTJU as well, and Zingomi here was at WTJU 79 to 83 shares a memory that the main business sponsor recalled was Back Alley Discs. They sponsored the rock album of the day and let the rock and jazz directors choose 5 albums a week. What you know, do y'all remember?
And it's not a coincidence that Hal Dean, who I mentioned earlier, and Pat Bawley, who's on the call here, were both working at Back Alley Discs. So there was a strong connection and it was the only record store in town. I think that's true, Pat. Can you nod if that's true? I don't know if there was another one or not. Yeah.
I worked there too.
Oh, you did?
I'm an alum of Back Alley. Yes, I am. And so was Donnie Gillespie.
Yeah.
Donnie Gillespie was an alum. Charlotte Lamont worked there.
Right.
And Bo Kirshner. So there's a bunch of TJU folks working there.
You know, it's interesting, Bill. You talk about this the radio station as part of as the centerpiece of a community, not only communal feeling of the staff itself, but the community beyond who felt comfortable coming in. I think a WTJU at a much smaller scale, of course, was very much the same thing. It was a good hang. People would come and just sit down, introduce themselves, and you'd be playing stuff, and they'd say, well, what was that? And you talk about things, and you find out they knew something about things, and one day they might end up on the air too, or they might just continue to come and hang out. There was very much a sense of community about it, which I think we have been successful at maintaining through until now. And part of that, you mentioned ownership. Well, WTJU has an owner as well. It happens to, at least during, it is listed on the introduction to this, that I was the station manager. That was a volunteer position. Now we have a real professional station manager.
Is that what I am?
But during the 1 year that of the 4 I was at TJU that I was the station manager, I don't remember having a single piece of correspondence from the university, a conversation, someone calling, a meeting being called, calling me to task for something. I don't even remember filing any papers with the FCC. I mean, maybe somebody did that, but you'd have thought that if it was done, it would have been me. And I don't remember doing it. So our ownership was as hands-off as could be imagined, to its credit. And I think today, although the connection between Nathan and the ownership is much stronger today, it's because we are considered to be an integral part of the arts community at the university, which is a good thing. It's not an interference. I think it's a very positive thing. But back in those days, they left us alone. And that was exactly what we wanted. And we weren't trying to be on anybody's radar. We weren't, self-censoring too terribly much. And there was, a lot of drug and sex references and those kinds of things. People tried to avoid the kind of language that might get you into trouble with the FCC. And there were some pranks that got out of hand from time to time, but that's, I think, to be expected from a bunch of college students. But the fact is, we also had an owner. They just didn't seem to care, which was great.
Right. And I mean, certainly other college radio stations haven't always had the same fate that WTJU.
Oh, yeah.
There's that quality that I think is lived on in community stations, particularly from BCN, which is nobody came there through an ad in a newspaper or being recruited. People came there by either coming and volunteering, or their girlfriend worked there, or they wandered in, or there was some, posters would get done because somebody would walk in the door and go, hey, you guys need a poster? I do, it just was that very kind of natural flowing, way about it, that just people, again, as you're saying, just sort of felt connected to it. And so, very different than other radio stations or other businesses, at the time.
In the last few minutes we've got left here, I want to ask you, Bill, first, what should today's radio stations and sort of media makers learn from WBCN of the late 60s and 70s?
I think that that there, and it's something I think that also flowed through into my working, in journalism. And I worked for a while with Jimmy Breslin on a show for ABC News, and his whole thing about, if all the reporters are going this way, go the other way. I think that one of the things that hit me as a young person working at BCN was that news, to a large extent, was the news of people in power. Here's the head of the teachers union and Nancy Pelosi in the White House and arguing about when to open schools. But really the stories of people, who are trying to make a difference in their lives, that aren't often given airtime and coverage, even with a 24-hour news cycle. There are people and stories and music and culture that just is out there that is deserving of exposure. And I think that that's sort of the role of community stations. I think just, in closing, one last thought about that is, I think when radio first started in the 30s, when they were running out of spots on the dial and they had to start licensing stations, the idea was that you would get a radio license, but you would hold it in the public's name. It was for the public
Right.
good, the public convenience, which I've always thought was interesting. And for everybody that didn't have a license. And I really believe this, that the vision of what radio could and should be was much more like BCN and what community radio stations are than what anything else is on the dial. Even NPR, as good as NPR is and as important it is, and the coverage, you know, those are national shows, national coverage. I think really the intent of radio was to give voice to people in a community, and in good times and bad times. And I think, I think it lives on in community radio.
It's funny, Bill. I actually was just talking with Bill Siemering, who wrote the original NPR mission statement a couple weeks ago, who said basically the same thing.
Really, that's interesting to know.
Yeah, yeah. Rus and Marcia, in our last couple of minutes, can media still touch lives the way it did in that spirit of the 70s? TJU.
I think it still is. And I was just thinking about just 3 years ago at this point, during that awful day in August, when you, Nathan, and Tyler were down in the park, and TJU was right there, and then a few years earlier, when Teresa Sullivan almost got kicked out by that odd woman, and they had that big rally at the Rotunda, and she and TJU was broadcasting right there as well. So I think that in a way, I think TJU is experiencing a bit of a resurgence and community participation and being right there with the community. And I think there's definitely a future.
Rus, what's your closing thought on?
Well, I think the TJU continues to be a music forward station. This is a place where people who are interested in presenting music come together to experience music together, to promote it, and to share it in ways that they find interesting and hope that there's an audience who agrees with them. I think the roots of that date back to the period that we're talking about, and it's been a continuous theme all the way through, which is kind of miraculous, frankly, that has been a common thread all the way through. But because so many of us came to the station from having experienced either BCN or WHFS, who were showing us the way to present music that way, and were taking advantage of this real gap in broadcasting at the time. We all learned from those places and then carried it forward. And then, as I say, miraculously have continued to do that now for whatever it is, 40 years or something. And Bill, I want to thank you so much for having put the film together, because it really shares, it helps me to remember a whole lot, but it shares some very important values about broadcasting that we can't lose track of. I think there is a responsibility for us to participate as promoters of the arts. We aren't just selling ads. In fact, we aren't selling any ads. But it's a really important thing for radio to do, and more, in fact, of the dial ought to be dedicated to that. And just like in the state of Virginia, if you want to sell alcohol, you got to sell a certain amount of beer. You got to sell a certain amount of food to be able to keep your liquor license. If you want to have right-wing talk shows, you got to have a certain amount of rock and roll on there too. There ought to be a rule like that. But anyway, there isn't. There just ought to be.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining the call. And Bill Lichtenstein, filmmaker of WBCN and the American Revolution, thanks for not only joining us, but also making the movie and making it available to WTJU listeners to view through our website. If you haven't seen it, again, WTJU.net, you can log in and stream it there. It's a $10 rental fee, and it's a nice partnership between us and Bill's production company. So I really appreciate everybody who does that. And then thanks for us. Thanks, Marcia, both long time WTJU alums and currently involved still as well, lo these almost 4 decades later. So thank you both so much for taking the time out of your afternoon. If you've got any follow-up questions or comments, feel free to shoot me an email. It's nathan.moore@virginia.edu. We're going to keep doing these monthly radio talks series on the final Friday of each month. Next month, I've got my student station, WXTJ, who's going to curate one of those talks on local music in Charlottesville. So that should be a pretty good one to make sure you check out here on Zoom. Anyway, thanks again. And y'all have a great rest of your afternoon and a great weekend while you socially distance.
Yeah, good to see you, everybody.
Good meeting everybody.
Yeah. Goodbye. See ya.